Welcome to day 3 of the Novel Challenge. My name is Brad Pauquette, and today we're going to talk about conflicts. Now, I know that you're probably excited to get writing on this project. That's what you came for, right? Was to write a novel, not just think about writing a novel. But let me just assure you that this time that we're spending on these topics now will pay off down the road. You know, everybody is excited when you begin a project. My heart for you is what your excitement level is and what your discipline level is when you're 30,000 words into a project, because that's when it gets difficult. And all of this theoretical talking that we're doing, all of this planning that we're doing right now, that's when it pays off, is when you get into the middle of the project and you've been working on it and working on it. And everybody's kind of tired of hearing about it. And it's not quite so much fun as it was in the beginning. And you really need to begin to exercise that discipline and push through. And in that moment, when part of your brain is saying, this is stupid, just give up, but the other part of your brain says, no, this is worth it, that's when your plan comes into handy. That's when it's so useful to be able to tell that stupid side of your brain, hey, no, I made a plan. I know that this story works. And while it won't be perfect, that's not the point of a draft. The point of a draft is to be done. And I'm going to have a story that works at the end of this. I'm going to have something that I can use. So stick with me. It's all right to dabble a little bit with your story, but don't get carried away. Make sure that you complete these planning stages before you really get into the writing. So, conflicts obviously are really important to a story. Without conflicts, we really don't have a story. In fact, it's part of the definition of a story. So, in my work as a developmental editor, I encounter books that are too fat and books that are too skinny. Books that are too fat is when like an author has crammed every idea they've possibly ever thought of into one book. And it's just so bloated and there's so many different storylines, so many different sequences we're supposed to follow, so many different characters. And it's just really hard to relate to. And even when we get to the end, we don't get that satisfied, like cathartic experience because there really was too much going on that I couldn't connect to any one particular thing in the story. So that's a novel that's too fat. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have a novel that's too thin. And that's when maybe the author had a cool premise or a cool idea for the book, but they really just stretched that. And maybe it should have been like a short story or novella, but they've really just tried to stretch it as far as it could go to get to a novel length work. And in that case, while we can follow the plot, there just isn't enough to keep us interested and relating to the story for 50,000 plus words. So we want a novel that isn't too fat or too skinny. We want it to be just right. We're looking for the three bears of a novel here, right? And one of the primary ways we control whether a novel is too fat or too skinny is with the number of conflicts. The amount of conflict in your story is what determines whether we can follow what's going on or not. And it's actually a lot simpler than it seems. There's a specific number of conflicts that we need to be developed in the story, and that number is 5. So that's where we're going today. But before we get to what those 5 conflicts are, we first need to define what a conflict even is. A conflict is two things in tension. So many times, especially for certain genres like memoirs, we settle for challenges and obstacles and not conflicts in our story. And the difference is whether something opposes that action. So to become a Navy SEAL or to run a marathon, those are challenges, right? Those are obstacles to overcome. You're going to have to really try hard. It's going to be tough. However, if nothing is opposing you in those goals, it's really not a conflict. It becomes a conflict when something is standing on the other side, trying to actively prevent you from reaching that goal. And once we identify that tension point, now we have a real conflict in the story. And so I've found that it is best to state conflicts as two ideas in tension. So a lot of times in like a literature class, if you took literature in high school or college or something, you might have discussed a story like Star Wars. I mean, probably not Star Wars, but a story like Star Wars, you would have discussed it and you would have said, well, Luke's internal conflict is Luke versus his identity. And that's a true story. And you can write a paper on that idea that the conflict is Luke versus his identity. But from an author standpoint, that's not, if you're writing this story from that basis, it's not going to give you a lot to work with. I mean, what do you write? What scene do you craft to show Luke versus his identity? I mean, you practically have nothing. It's a wide open box. You could talk about anything at that point. But if instead we talk about his internal conflict as two specific things in tension, now it provides fodder for us to write about. So rather than Luke versus his identity, we might state his internal conflict as Luke wants to be a starfighter pilot versus Luke wants to be a good son in his adopted family. And now we have two things that are in tension because, based on Uncle Owen in the story of Star Wars, Luke can't do both because his uncle has forbid him from becoming a pilot. And so now we have these two incompatible things. He wants two things, but it's impossible for Luke to have both of them at the same time. Why this is easier is because now I can craft scenes that show how much Luke wants to be a starfighter pilot. For instance, there's a scene where he's really childishly actually like playing with this toy starship while he talks to R2D2. And then we can also craft scenes that show him that he wants to be a good son, like we see Luke helping his uncle pick out droids and eating dinner with his family and things like that. And so when we have these two specific statements rather than this nebulous kind of Luke versus his identity thing, now we have stuff that we can craft scenes around. So there are three types of conflicts that we're going to talk about in relationship to a novel length work. First one is an internal conflict. An internal conflict is a conflict that is happening inside the head and the heart of the character. So a lot of times that's a decision that needs to be made. Do I do this or do I do that? It could be a moral decision, or it could be a question of loyalty. Like, am I loyal to this person or that person? Those are all examples of internal conflicts, and that's not the whole list. But any conflict, anything that's in tension inside of the character is potentially an internal conflict. We also have external conflicts. External conflicts happen outside of the character's body. So they are conflicts with another person or with another group of people. But those are conflicts that anybody could see and observe happening in the outside world. And finally, we have philosophical conflicts. Philosophical conflicts are two ideas or two paradigms in tension. For instance, capitalism versus communism, right? So if we were to state those as two defensible positions, it would be like capitalism is the fastest way to the greatest good for the people versus communism is the fastest way to the greatest good for the people. And now we could craft scenes that pit those two ideas against each other. So that's a philosophical conflict. Now, in a short story, we could stop there. You could write a story that has an internal conflict, an external conflict, and a philosophical conflict, and it would be so robust. That would be just the right fatness for a short story that's 10,000 words or something like that. But for a novel length work, there's one more layer of complexity. So in a novel length work, we have a little world and a big world. The little world are conflicts that really only affect the protagonist. And while there might be some like trickle down effect if the protagonist succeeds or fails in his personal little world conflicts, it's not going to create big systemic change. And big world conflicts are conflicts that affect larger groups of people. That if there was a success or failure in a big world conflict, it would impact lots and lots of people. So the reason that this is important is because this is how your real world works, right? And so, the story that we write has to represent the reality that we live in. And the reality is that you are part of a little world and part of a big world. So you have all kinds of little world conflicts in your life. For instance, if you are up for a promotion at work against somebody else, it's either you or Larry that's going to get this promotion at work. That's a little world conflict. While it's very important to you and it has real outcomes for your immediate circle, your family, and things like that, from a global perspective, it really doesn't matter, right? Either you or Larry are going to get an incremental raise, and the other one is going to stay exactly the same. And from a global planet Earth perspective, it really doesn't matter if Larry gets it or if you get it. If you're arguing with your spouse about how to decorate the living room, maybe what color couch to buy for your living room, that really it can very well be a conflict. Believe me, I believe you if you're in that conflict. But nonetheless, it really only affects you, right? The consequences of that choice won't affect large groups of people, won't trickle into eternity or anything like that. When you resolve that conflict, it's going to stop right there with your immediate family. Maybe your guests that come over will have a slightly different impression, but that's it. And if I can give you an advice, just let your spouse win. It's not that important. What kind of car you buy, or say you're in conflict with the car dealership, you want to pay a certain price and they are opposing you, and because they want to sell the car at a higher price. So you have that conflict there. You guys will eventually resolve that, or you won't. You'll walk away from the deal, but there will be no long lasting effect from that conflict. You also, however, are part of some conflicts that exist in the bigger world. You are part of groups that potentially have larger impact. And the impact that these groups have doesn't have to be global, it doesn't even have to be serious, but nonetheless, you are part of groups. For instance, you might be a part of your church's softball team, and your softball team is going to play, Central Baptist next Sunday, and one of you is going to win, but the outcome of that conflict will affect everybody in that group. And even though it's a small group and the outcome is not important, that's still a big world conflict. Other examples would be like your job, not your personal promotion, but you are part of a company at work, and that company is competing against other companies, right? You work for Verizon, and you are competing against AT&T, and the outcome of that conflict will have impact on lots of people, the employees, the customers, the shareholders, etc. You may have a political affiliation. And so, how your political party fares this November could have big world impact. In stories, we see all kinds of big world conflicts. And again, it doesn't have to be like a major crisis or anything like that. The only point of the big world is that you are part of a larger group. So we see Star Wars Rebels versus Alliance. We see all kinds of movies with Axis versus Allies, or the United States versus Russia. We see movies with Protestants versus Catholics, et cetera, or Newsies versus Union Busters. So we have little world conflicts that only affect the protagonist, and then we have big world conflicts that affect larger groups of people. So within the little world, we can have an internal, an external, and a philosophical conflict. So to use Star Wars as an example, in fact, not we can have, but we need to have those three things. And so to use Star Wars as an example, in the little world, Luke has an internal conflict. He has something that he's struggling with in his own mind and heart. On one hand, he wants to be a starfighter pilot, but on the other hand, he wants to be a good son in his family. And so eventually he does resolve that conflict by joining another family, right? He becomes a family member of the Rebel Alliance, so to speak. But that's a real conflict. That's a tension point that he must endure through the course of the story until it's resolved. Luke has an external conflict with Darth Vader. Luke versus Darth Vader is the conflict, and that's manifest in the Death Star. Luke wants to destroy the Death Star. Darth Vader would very much like it to stay all in one piece. And so they can't both have what they want. In that little world external conflict, usually there are two scenarios. Either one, both the protagonist, the good guy, and the antagonist, the bad guy, they want the same thing and they're competing for it, and only one of them can have it. This is a common feature of romance stories. There's two suitors and one love interest, and only one of them can have the girl. But it's also something like Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark, where Indiana and Belloc, who is the bad French archaeologist, they both want to recover the Ark of the Covenant, and only one of them can have it. So they are intentioned for that. Or the second scenario is that the protagonist and the antagonist have mutually exclusive goals, like Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader. They can't both have what they want at the same time because Luke wants to blow up the Death Star and Darth Vader wants to protect it. So one of them will win and one of them will lose. Then we also have a philosophical conflict in the little world. And this is usually presented as the protagonist is caught between two worldviews that are being presented to him, and he has to choose which one he's going to abide by. So in the case of Star Wars, Luke is he has two characters that are presenting philosophical ideas to him. Han Solo is a hedonist, and he believes that, life is short and fleeting. Get what you can and get out. Just, live the best life that you can right now. And that's contrasted with Obi-Wan Kenobi, who is a Taoist, essentially. It's not specified in the movie, but that's the closest Earth remnant to his Earth related philosophy to what he's speaking. And so Obi-Wan is a Taoist. He says, the universe is all bound together, and the most important thing you can do is to seek out and fulfill your destiny. So Luke is caught between these two paradigms, this paradigm that says life is short, get what you can, and the other paradigm that says the most important thing is to seek out and fulfill your destiny. And so he's caught between them, and he has to choose which one he'll abide by. So we have that set of little world conflicts, which is enough to make the story complex and robust, that we have a lot of meat to hang on to in that story. But it's not so much that the audience is going to get bogged down in the story and not be able to follow what's going on, or to not feel resolved at the end because there's just too many conflicts to keep track of. So 3 conflicts in the little world is the appropriate number: an internal conflict, an external conflict, and a philosophical conflict. Then we have the big world. And in the big world, we typically only have 2 conflicts, and that's because it's kind of impossible to have an internal conflict. I shouldn't say impossible. I'm still waiting for somebody to give me a really good example of an internal conflict in a big world sense. However, it's kind of impossible for a group of people to have an internal conflict. So typically in the big world, we just have 2 conflicts: an external conflict and a philosophical conflict. So the external conflict is practically always 2 groups of people against each other. So in the case of Star Wars, Rebel Alliance versus the Empire. 2 groups of people with mutually exclusive goals. They can't both have what they want. It's possible that they could reach a compromise, but at least based on the premise of the story, the beginning of the story, they have mutually exclusive positions. They can't both succeed unless something changes. And then we also have a big world philosophical conflict, which presents 2 big ideas about how the world ought to be. Usually, those ideas are associated with the people groups. So, like in Star Wars, that big world philosophical conflict that we see is that freedom must be obtained at all costs versus stability must be obtained at all costs. So, the Rebel Alliance presents the case for freedom, and the Empire presents the case for stability. And then we see that work out through the story. So those are the 5 conflicts that you're going to see across all kinds of different novels and films. Really, regardless of the genre, these 5 conflicts are going to be present in a well-developed and robust story. But it's important that there's 5 and only 5. Too many conflicts, and we get a novel that's too fat. It's difficult to follow, difficult to relate to, and we don't get a satisfied feeling at the end. Too few conflicts, and the novel's too skinny. It just fails to it crushes under the weight of 50,000 words and fails to retain our attention for a novel length work. So, one of the most important things that you can take from this lesson is that a conflict must be 2 things in tension. If there isn't something opposing this action or idea, then it's really not a conflict. It might be a challenge, it might be an obstacle, but it's not a conflict. So as you're noodling on this idea of conflicts and how it relates to the ideas that you've been developing, you need to always think, now what is opposed to this? And that's the substance of conflict. So you have an assignment today. Start thinking about conflict in relationship to these ideas that you've been brainstorming. Think about all 5 types of conflict. Your protagonist, do they have an internal conflict? What's going on inside? Is there an external conflict and a philosophical conflict? What worlds are they caught between? What ideas are they being forced to consider for the first time? And then, while our initial brainstorming usually focuses really tightly on the protagonist, we also need to make sure that we're opening up the world and we're looking at potential big world external and philosophical conflicts. And as I mentioned before, if you're starting with a topic, like there's some hot button issue that you really want to write a book about, or it doesn't really have to be a hot button issue, it could be a theological issue that's been around for 2,000 years if you want. But if there's an issue that you want to start thinking about, then sometimes you start with that big world philosophical conflict and you ask, what's in tension to this idea? What would be the other side of the coin, so to speak? And then you can begin to develop your other conflicts and your protagonist from there. So take the time to really start considering how conflicts relate to those ideas that you're developing. As your time allows, continue the study on this. As with the other topics we've been discussing, there's a lot more to be said on this. There's more nuance, and some of it will make the development process a little bit easier. It's not all just academics, but there really is value in a little bit more additional information that will help you to complete the development process here. So check out the Novel Matrix book and check out the Novel Matrix classes on the company's website. Both of those resources are going to be really helpful for you. And as further time allows, observe the five conflicts. If you've watched a movie recently for one of the other topics we've talked about, consider how the five conflicts relate to that movie. Or watch another movie tonight, or watch the same movie again. Even sometimes that can be helpful to further develop your understanding of how the conflicts were used to craft particular scenes in the movie that you're watching. So that's your assignment for today. Just continue to brainstorm, continue to noodle on these things, and allow God to inspire your work and to develop these pieces one step at a time. So I will see you tomorrow for day 4, where we will talk about characters. Until then, happy writing and be blessed.